Love that.
Thank you. All right. Hello, and thank you for taking part in 2021's DiverseU Building Community. Before we begin, I would like to note that we are recording each DiverseU session so that we can make them accessible after the event is over. Please keep this in mind as you engage in this space, as your questions and comments will be included in the recording. DiverseU is a celebration of diversity. I'm sure we're all eager to find out what can be learned by attending these sessions, but first, a few ground rules. This important student-led program creates learning spaces where people from various disciplines can facilitate discussions in an engaging academic setting. These ground rules are in place to assist our presenters in maintaining dignity and respect in those spaces. So here are a few guidelines for participating in the discussion and how we can better serve and respect this learning experience for everyone involved. Guideline 1, communicate direct personal experience and not secondhand experiences. In doing so, we rely on I statements like, I was affected by an incident where, and I know in my own life I have experienced. Guideline 2, speak for yourself, not as a representative of any group or any other person. Along the same idea, do not single anyone out to be an expert in order to speak on behalf of any group. Guideline 3, if you do wish to reference studies outside your own experience, we invite you to cite academic studies collected from various academic journals and databases, such as those available through the Mansfield Library. Guideline 4, be respectful and courteous throughout each presentation, whether you agree with the presenter or not. Our central mission here is civil discourse. Be mindful of the amount of space you are taking up and allow others to share in the dialogue. Guideline 5, be mindful that many of the presenters are in a space of vulnerability due to the personal nature of each topic. As an institute of higher learning, we depend on the student conduct code to ensure each presenter is treated with dignity and respect. Guideline 6, active listening is more than hearing. It is expressed in our presence in the room. Based on this fact, we ask that while you are in the learning space, you silence your phone. If you do need to text or talk on the phone, we ask that you respectfully step outside of the meeting space to tend to those communications. Please note that these rules apply to individuals and groups that are not students, and we will enforce them should poor conduct occur from any person. Thank you for coming, and I will now turn it over to our presenter to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. I really appreciate it. Hi, I'm Madeline Tecmire. I am a poet at the University of Montana's Master of Fine Arts program. I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, lived nowhere else before I came here to Missoula. And I absolutely love it here in Missoula. I brought my dog with me. I've had her since I was 18, and she absolutely loves the river. We have a good time out here. I also am a volunteer at the YWCA here in town, the Missoula YWCA, and which is where I get a lot of my information for this presentation. So today we will be tackling tough topics about domestic violence, sexual violence, and manipulation. Please, everyone, feel free to take care of yourselves how you need to throughout this presentation. If you need to leave and take a minute, you're not hurting my feelings, please go do you. And one more disclaimer before I begin. I want it to be known that for the sake of everybody in the room, that domestic violence takes place in all relationships. 1 of every 3 women and 1 of every 4 men have endured some form of domestic violence in their lifetime. But for the sake of this presentation, I will be focusing on violence against women in heterosexual relationships. So in my lit class right now, I'm taking a lit class with Ashby Kinch, who's really cool. If you guys haven't taken a class with him, you guys should. And I'm studying courtly dress in Ashby Kinch's class of the medieval era. So I'm trying to get to the bottom of how medieval dress kind of works as a form of currency. So the clothing during the medieval times, people would trade it like money rather than actual capital. And so this, there were different aspects to this. There was a little term called largesse, which meant the most elite dress would have to give away their clothes to the less fortunate. But that kind of skewed the lines of who was elite and who was beneath the poverty line. So they created sumptuary laws to start controlling how people dress. So the sumptuary laws kept everybody in a certain demographic. They could only own 1 suit in a year. And Jane Burns, who wrote the book on courtly dress, or courtly undressed, excuse me, Burns explores the idea of identity and courtly dress during the medieval era, and within her dissection of many texts, she brings up a poem written in the perspective of a jealous husband, a term that Burns coined, who didn't appreciate his wife's deceptive dress since she was socially ranked below him. After accusing his wife of wearing extravagant garments to purchase, After accusing his wife of wearing extravagant garments to catch the eyes of other men, he said, "Have nothing from me but a coat and a surcoat of coarse wool and a hempen kerchief, not finely woven, but coarse and poorly made, torn and patched." This kind of manipulation is common in relationships with an alternating power dynamic. Since the jealous husband was in a higher elite class, he was degrading his wife for being in a lower elite class, and he later compared her in the poem to dung covered in silk. And I want to read that quote about it. Well, I guess this is Jane Burns dissecting that quote, but he basically says that she's as hideous as dung covered in silk, and he was just trying to reaffirm his misogynistic idea that women are sexually deceptive. And Byrne concludes that the husband's overt claim argues instead against superficial adornment, whether violets, roses, lilies, or silk cloth, by asserting that women's deception hides a corrupted, fleshy body, characteristically ugly and vile. This debased female flesh, seductively disguised by false ornament and elegant attire, the husband defines baldly as dung covered in silk, insisting that the dung heap is still a dung heap, no matter how ornately it may be clothed. As I was reading her analysis of all of these quotes that her husband was saying to his wife, I was really getting flashbacks of what it's like to take phone calls at the YWCA and the 24-hour hotline. The Missoula YWCA is a fantastic local resource for those of you who aren't familiar with the YWCA. We provide support groups for adults and children who've witnessed domestic violence. We provide emergency housing, and we also offer other resources to help support survivors, like a stipend for finding their own place to live that's outside of our facility, stuff like that. But we just want to make sure that we are able to support survivors and empower them to move forward with their lives. And while the husband wasn't violent in this poem that Jane Burns was dissecting, I think it's really important that we take these kinds of areas of manipulation and degradation, and that we take them as seriously as violence in relationships. In a 2019 memoir, Stephanie Land, who also graduated from the University of Montana's Master of Fine Arts program in nonfiction, I think that's really cool. And she wrote a memoir about her experience with domestic violence, and it was recently adapted into a Netflix TV show called Made, and it's a fantastic TV show. If you haven't seen it, it's a great representation of gendered poverty and the red tape that keeps domestic violence survivors from seeking safer shelter. I'm going to show a clip from the first episode where she goes to visit a social worker after her boyfriend at the time. Actually, I think I did the share wrong. Let me make sure I did it right. Okay, I did it right. So at the very beginning, this is like the third scene maybe into the show, but at the very beginning, there was a domestic dispute between her and her boyfriend. They have a child together, three-ish, I think. And he threw something at her. He didn't actually come in contact with her. And that was enough for her to be like, I'm done with this. I got to get out of this. And so she went to a social worker to help her find a job. And this is what takes place.
Are you the child's legal guardian?
Yes.
Can you prove that?
I could show you my stretch marks.
Are you currently under the influence of any drugs or alcohol?
No.
Are you sure? Because you look strung out.
Nope. We slept in the car last night, so.
So you're homeless.
No. No, I wouldn't say that.
So you have a home.
I had a home and then we left it. Maddie's dad just, he drinks and, he blacks out and punches stuff.
This is some kind of fucking fairy tale, Alex!
Punches you?
No,
Punches Maddie?
no, just last night was different and I got scared.
Did you file a police report?
No.
Do you want to call the cops now? It's not too late.
And say what, that he didn't hit me?
Well, there's shelters for domestic violence victims, but you need to go on record with your abuse.
I'm not abused.
Okay, hon. So according to you, you're not abused and you're not homeless. Why are you here?
We don't have anywhere to sleep tonight.
What about Mom? It says here she's local.
I would rather sleep in my car.
Dad?
My family's not an option.
Are you currently employed?
Nope.
It says here you went to 6 different high schools.
Yeah, my mom moved around a lot, and then eventually I got my GED in 2016.
I mean, college, technical schools.
I got into college, but I didn't go.
Is there anything that you can give me? Any special skills?
No.
All right, here's the deal. I need 2 pay stubs in order to get you on the list for subsidized housing, and even then, the wait list is long. In the meantime, there's a mission over at St. Carmel's, and they usually have beds open.
I can't take Maddie there.
Sure you can. Get there early. Where Deet?
I'm sorry, is there anything else that you could actually do for us here, please?
Honestly, without a job, I can't do squat.
Okay, I can't get a job if I can't afford daycare.
Well, we have access to subsidized daycare grants once you have a job.
I need a job to prove that I need daycare in order to get a job? What kind of fuckery is that?
All right. I thought that was a really interesting clip because I think that it's really interesting that she doesn't have a job and she's going in there and she can't get anywhere without a job. And when you think about where she is after her relationship, after all the undoing that manipulation, isolation, and financial isolation takes on a person, and when they're trying to get out of this situation, she only has a place to stay with her daughter in her car. She doesn't have anywhere else that she can go. And one thing that didn't get into this clip was that the social worker was trying to encourage her to go to the DV shelter, and because they have emergency housing and they would house both of them. And she said, I won't take a bed away from someone experiencing real domestic violence. And said that, what am I going to say to the police, that he didn't hit me? When Alex fled her home at the beginning of May, her boyfriend threw a bowl at her head, though she dropped to the floor before it hit her, and the bowl went straight through the wall. We need to start accepting the intent of pain and violence, even if it wasn't carried out. That's why it's so important for people to be aware of how isolation and manipulation take place, because violence is the final and sometimes fatal tactic of domestic violence. Right now, I'm working on a book of poems that explores domestic spaces where our secrets are smoke in the wallpaper. I'll read several poems for all of you where I'm attempting to capture domestic violence in modern eras like dating apps and between other relationships. These poems explore how domestic spaces provide private and rageful releases of energy, and how a home can morph into a whole if you let the violence in. I'm tired of the grief, towering from the sink, porcelain cities whole enough to wind up shattered, littered air seeping from my throat like scalding sausages of magma. Why am I so angry? Why am I looking for myself in the laundry and uncovering prescription glasses, the room bleeding, hot color, patient rage breeding this rotting room? How can I shatter with more control? How can I floss tie my teeth to my tongue, my breath a crispy bite, chattered and swallowed through brimming bellies, again and again? I grind myself in squeegeed wines and swallow again and again. I fever palm fine china and I fling it into the fucking sky. The speaker in this poem was overwhelmed by domestic chores expected to be cleaned only by her and how she grapples with that rage. This poem is extremely internalized, guided by her own thought of perfection and imperfection and how she should behave in a domestic space. When we come to her thought, how can I shatter with more control? The poem takes a turn to the overwhelming rage of being underappreciated. And while there are no other round characters in this poem, the brimming bellies in the third stanza introduces a certain expectation of the speaker that she's trapped in the cycle of and cannot break out of without her own rage. This poem was inspired by the book Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Kamali. Excuse me if I said that wrong, and please correct me, which dissects all the ways that women are made to feel faulted for their rage and how rage is one of the most important tools for a person altogether. Because it's our body's way of communicating that something's wrong and something's violating our moral code. So I wrote this poem as a reclamation of female rage that's carried out in an imbalanced domestic space. Cocooning. Hold me rough. Squeeze me until I ooze between your fingers. I want to drip down your wrists. Part my knees with yours. Let's make a mess of our legs, a tangle of limbs removed and reattached to the wrong body. I don't want my legs to be traced back to me. Rest your elbows heavy over my waist. Push into my lungs, I don't mind. Your thumb tracing the ridges of my spine. Let me feel your long shoulder. Silk meadows across your back, the vibrating velvet tickling my palm as I stroke your hair to sleep. Breathe heavy into my neck. We'll limb cocoon, love. Wrap so tight when the morning glare gleams, our damp bodies unravel, butterflies fluttering off flesh. One with white yellow wings made of sugar, shimmering by the window. So with my book that I'm trying to write in completion, it's still under construction, of course, but this poem, I'm thinking a lot about domestic spaces and heterosexual relationships and how those interact with each other. And I was like, I need to have a love poem in this book, but like, where does it belong in a book full of violence and hate, most honestly? And I was like, we need to have an anti-love poem. And so I wrote this poem from the perspective of from the perspective of I like to say survivor, but since she's in the situation, I want to say victim. But she is the victim of domestic violence, the I in the poem. And the first stanza opens with very violent images, not very violent, but a violent and aggressive language. Hold me rough, squeeze me until I ooze between your fingers. I want to drip down your wrists. And then we get a couple more places, push into my lungs, I don't mind. And as we get to the end, it turns into a very touching love poem. And there's no sign of the violence or aggression anymore. And I really wanted that to pull off how intimacy can subdue violence, but it doesn't completely separate them. And I wanted this poem to track the fact that she's kind of forgetting about the violence that's taking place at the beginning of the poem, even if it's not enacted against her, you know? Finders keepers. Forcing his fingers into my throat, he tells me I'm a good girl. Wetting my nipples with congealed snot stringing from his knuckles. His teeth rake me tender, just before his thighs begin to tremble. And he tells me he loves me, as surely as splintered morning wind. He pretends the lingerie tucked into the top sheet is mine, and I press the iron through the crotch of her panties, until sizzle melted polyester bubbles up the sides, until I open all the windows and blast my heartbeats back into these studded bones. I pack pipes with our promises and blow sooted sorrow to the ceiling. This house shakes her off like shingle dust. I flushed my ring down the toilet and told him I wasn't thinking. I was distracted by the daytime soaps. Dominic is cheating on his fiance, you know. Can you believe it? He doesn't believe it. But sifts my shit with our finest kitchen strainer, and that diamond gleams again while he jokes about unconditional love, leaving it shining on the counter for me to collar myself. I love the cliche of soap operas that women are just sitting around watching soap operas all day while their husbands are filing in and out. And for this poem, I really wanted to take that cliche and really make something out of it and let their relationship be the soap opera and let this be very dramatic. And when I think about this poem, I really want it to be an angry poem, kind of like my opening one, I'm tired of the grief. I want it to be very rageful, but as I wrote it, it kind of became very comical, and it kind of, the speaker just she changed her mind, honestly. And she was just like, what a good outcome that was. And I actually liked that kind of power and empowerment in that poem rather than rage, because I feel like while rage tells us what we need to know, comedy and music and celebration and taking care of your home the way it needs to be, that's really what's empowering. Fragmenting. It's not a question of love, it's the loss, cried into the drywall. When our backs touch and you snore like bands of hummingbirds, delving in synchrony, wholly together, steadily persistent, navigating the rhythms of the wind. How I wish to tie you up in strings, shoulders, hands, and elbows. I'll puppet you over my waist, fingers thumbing the freckle behind my earlobe, lips leaving lines of lip prints like love notes for me to find. Words so tender I could slice them. I could suckle myself back to sleep. But you bare your teeth in your sleep. My hand trails your ribs without pause, without echo. When I stir my fingers into your chest, sometimes you hold my knuckles to your throat. Most times, I don't turn around at all. So I think a lot about Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, all the dating apps that our latest generations, really that's kind of how people meet people now. And it's so stigmatized that we don't actually talk about it enough, I don't think. I myself feel a lot of shame just talking about it. I don't care though, but I'm just saying there's a lot of there's a lot of problems around it. And I think we need to talk about how unsafe and how Tinder can invite domestic violence into people's homes. Thankfully, I've never been in a situation where I've had to fight my way out of or even feel like I've had to become violent to be able to protect my life, but that's not uncommon for a lot of people. I read this Tinder article a few years ago that a woman was, she was drugged at whatever restaurant they were at, and it was supposed to make her feel sick. It wasn't a roofie or something, but it was supposed to make her vomit. So he would take her home, and he took her home, got her in bed and left, but left with her keys. And then he let himself back in, and he brought a bunch of tools. He brought a tarp. He had every intention of doing some really, really sadistic things to that woman. And so I think about that often, and how all my girlfriends in Missoula, we have a group chat that we text into when we feel unsafe, when we want someone to know where we are. And this next poem is, the title is Found Text from that group chat. But I do want to give a disclaimer that this poem does include images of sexual violence. So please take care of yourself how you need to. Mary started sharing her location. She walked him out, checking for her keys in the bowl, making sure he didn't steal them so he could let himself back in, so he could listen to her shower, water beating off her immaculate body. She wondered if he'd kill her. Like that Tinder article, she was drugged, driven home by maliciously respectful hands. He took her keys on his way out, returning with a tarp, a table saw, a cattle taser. Mary didn't care. Her keys stirred in the bowl, and he was shorter than her anyway. It wasn't cute. Like when she met him at his house, him hollering from his bedroom, naked, hungry, and grinning. But he kissed her, and that felt okay. Fumbling with her belt, he moaned his plans for her. Something about a swing in the living room. Something about turning this pussy to minced meat. And when he threw her into the wall, she asked for her clothes. She dressed quickly, fingers refusing buttonholes. He persisted, opening her shirt, groaning. Shoes dangling by throbbing hands, she left her best bra. He said women don't do this to him. They don't leave before he's finished. Life of the Party, after Olivia Gatwood. She's wearing a backpack with national park pins from 5 family vacations, but not this year. She's hosting the football team plus their +4s, liquor she kissed the gas station boy for, something worse than 3 olives and dry gin, but they'll drink it because they're supposed to. They'll kneel in the grass, throats milking stale beer that reminds them of TV dinners cooling beneath their dad's cigarette smoke. And some of them are shuffling 2 girls upstairs once they fell through the coffee table. Others are scrubbing the blood from the carpet with peroxide. But the host, she's a grocery bag, folding in on itself. She threw up in the guest room, then pulled a sheet over it when he walked in. She sat back on her wrists, shuffling the suede with her hand. Don't you want to fuck me? Those words, even with her velvet tongue, toppled through her mouth like 6 hunks of dry mango. Olivia Gatwood is the poet that made me a poet. Before I found Olivia Gatwood, I was writing screenplays, which I thought was really, really bad fiction. And she recently came out with a book of poems called Life is the Party. And it's about women in true crime documentaries who are sensationalized. It's really good, highly recommend it. But I was really surprised about the book and how many poems were about children and juveniles who were getting into trouble. And it interested me in how humans learn different behaviors. And I wanted this poem to explore how drinking relinquishes control. And I wanted the dads to be kind of hanging out close by. And I also wanted to show how drinking really relinquishes control, but especially in minors and people who don't know how to do it well. And that's another place where domestic violence is being invited into a home without completely understanding what's happening. And then also at the end with the girl, the host, I wanted her to over-sexualize herself in a very uncomfortable and cringy way, because like she just vomited, she's not herself. And these are the things we need to talk about, is consent and what that means. You literally need to have somebody saying yes, because that was not an invitation and it wasn't a good one. Teach me. Clouds are reaching for me today, pattering cusped river water, rippling that gold muted glow. Should I melt into river rock? Will those rushing rapids tame my rowdy fringe? I want to be well loved. Teach me to be quieter, like whispered branches, humming white music to the leaves. Oh, wind, guide me to meld for the trees, whistling my own heart for vacant nests. Birds, teach me to leave. This little lyric poem, I wanted to explore the consequences of manipulation, with the speaker being a victim of domestic violence who so badly wants she so badly wants to be the person her partner wants her to be. She uses the harmony of nature to inspire a more tranquil woman, one without any trouble. The final stanza turns to the wind, an element that I believe moves the freest, where the speaker starts focusing on her own heart and what she wants. The final line revealing that she really just wants out of her environment, no matter the sacrifices she has to make to do that. And this is just one of those poems where I'm hoping that whatever audience I have can see when it's time to like weigh those and what starts to outweigh it, and that it's okay to make those decisions. Threading. He's a slot machine, dealing answers that still feel questionable. And maybe if questions were tangible, they'd feel like threading a needle with hair still sprouting from the skin. I'm sure it'd feel like him. When the machine revs and chunked hair winds into the bobbin, cheeks slammed into the feed dogs before the buzzing alerts the neighbors. They found me there before, asked me if I need help. I tell them I'm not even sure what the problem is. With this narrative of a woman threading a needle with her hair that's still coming out of her head, I wanted to demonstrate the confusion that happens in a manipulative domestic space. How in the poem, the speaker exposes herself to violence without understanding how or why. Tactics of isolation, gaslighting, and sexual intimidation. Abusers gain access to the mind of their partner, often accusing their own violent behaviors to be out of love or thoughtfulness. Abusers are masters at manipulating their environment, so they have complete control of it and the people occupying the space within it. This leads to survivors not understanding the gravity of their domestic situation. During one of my first training sessions at the YWCA, they explained how men often feel a need for power while women desire it, which opens the domestic violence conversation to utilizing one's privilege as abuse against a partner. Because men feel a need over power versus a desire over power, this establishes an immediate dynamic between the heterosexual couple. If male privilege is used to control his partner, for example, behave as a master in both sexual and non-sexual settings, financial access, and threatening to expose partner, whether it be nude images or private information. These are all subtle behaviors that are framed for the goodness of the couple and often overlooked as abuse. For dying love, he said it himself. It's the birth control making me crazy. I stopped swallowing sugar and I've been late since September, and that's not why I'm rain drenched at his door. I'm here for the rest of the pink packed pills. I want to know what it feels like swallowing 20 at once. It won't work, and I'll be forced to wait until my stomach inflates, becoming dinner rolled thighs and zerberted bellies. And isn't it enough that I forget to feed myself? Crowds bark about fingernails and murder, praying that I suffer like I do not suffer, healing after my love's extracted, like tumors choking that tattered bathroom air. When I smiled at soggy stripes and he said, I'm not mother material. Fuck the preacher who taught you to point. Because I heard that muted thud, those strawberry chunks scorched to ash. I imagined wombing myself into that almost baby, letting it sing over the sterile. It told me we're broken and held me as I wept. It told me he won't understand why I bleed, so I'll only bleed at night. It said I needed to settle into those stirrups, pluck it out like an engorged thorn. She said she's a she. She said it wasn't the birth control driving me crazy. At the YWCA, we focus on empowerment as access tools to each person's needs to move forward, housing, jobs, and daycare. But not all empowerment looks the same. Oftentimes, women will call to talk about their abusers, but once they release that energy, they don't want to move forward with the resources available to them anymore. While that's probably the most difficult part of my volunteer position, sometimes people aren't ready to be helped, and empowerment gives space for victims and survivors to navigate their journey to safety on their own terms. On average, it takes 7 to 10 attempts before a survivor leaves their abuser for good. It's a grueling process, but it's important to remind a survivor how to make decisions for themselves. Before I read my closing poem, I want it to be known that I'm a storyteller as prerequisite to poet. And as hard as I've tried to be more lyrical, more abstract, I've learned the process of making this presentation that the storytelling is a necessary craft. From the medieval era to Netflix TV shows, domestic abuse lives in literature left behind. And it's important to document these stories so we can capture how misogyny and violence against women has changed and how painfully long it stays the same. My idea when I sat down to write this last poem, where violence takes place against the speaker and after, while she's caring for her partner's hurting hand, she starts thinking about drinking the blood he bled into her palm. She's immediately repulsed by the idea, not from the grossness of drinking another person's bodily fluids, but because she's afraid that if she does, she'd be destined to become him. I'm using the blood as a metaphor for violence. When violence is enacted on a person, humans often respond violently. With this poem, I want to take a pause to think about how violence consumes us on TV, in books, in domestic relationships, how that level of intense stimulation can change our perspectives, and most importantly, it can change our moral code. I'd rather starve. Shrapnel burst against the door. Glass flecks rained in and out of my hair. We weren't afraid until they were embedded at the base of his nail. Champagne shouldn't shatter into powder inhaled, impaled pops of my lungs, blood coughed into our quilt, and I squeezed those heavy fingers, oozing plasma and blood trickling into my palm. It just pooled there, as if I'd bled our bed to pieces. I held his warmth, wondering if I should swallow it whole, like consuming him isn't that complicated. And even the sex made me feel sick. I raked love into his collarbone like I could chew right through him. And I did. So I disintegrated into leftover splat. mucking up the sink. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. I am willing to take whatever questions you guys have. Ask away. Also on Zoom, I'm happy to take questions. You can drop it into the chat or unmute yourself and let yourself be heard.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You earlier said something about, I want to say survivor, but in the context of the poem, I need victim. And I thought that was really interesting. So I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the distinction between those two things. Because I think that's something I hadn't really thought about before. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's actually something I picked up at the YWCA. I always use domestic violence victim before, like just when I was doing my readings and my research and whatever I was doing. I always use the term victim. And when I started working there, I noticed that everybody was using the term survivor, and especially in presentations, like when we were doing our training, they explained why that they say survivor rather than victim, because it gives a little bit more agency back with if they're survivors rather than victims. They have a lot less enacted on them, and it gives them a little bit more privacy and a little bit more empowerment on top of it. Good question. Any other questions?
So I'll jump in. Thank you for this, and for just being so vulnerable. You know, I think towards the end you had mentioned you kind of made the distinction between the storytelling impulse and the lyrical impulse, and I was curious as to how you kind of navigate those impulses.
Yeah, you know, I really do like writing lyrical poems and lyric poems and things that don't, you know, flow super well in a polished narrative form. But I feel like even when I'm writing a lyric poem, it has to make sense to me. And then I'm overwhelmed because I'm like, well, if it makes sense to me, how do I know like what my audience is reading? And so I'm always using some sort of narrative, even if I'm writing more lyrically, there's some sort of narrative there. Like that poem, Teach Me, The Cusped River Water. That's the most lyrical poem that I have. It has very little narrative elements, but I feel like I had to really ground myself in the setting when I was writing that along the river. And I think the setting's extremely developed in that poem, and that's really the only developed thing, I think. Yes.
So thank you again for your presentation. And I'm wondering, just a lot of the things you're writing is, you know, some super heavy content. How do you like take care of yourself and kind of like protect yourself as you're doing your writing, your research?
That's a great question. I feel like I started writing when I was young, and when I started writing, it was to release like all the energy that was inside of me, all the bad energy, all my bad thoughts. And I used to write a lot of screenplays. I wasn't a poet, but I used to write all kinds of, oh, she's trapped, let's get her out, you know, little fairy tales when I was young. And I think that's still how I work through almost everything that I go through. I almost feel like I don't know how I feel until I've written it down sometimes. And yeah, I think it's really kind of unique being a writer and love being a writer, like want to do this job forever. It's extremely emotionally draining, I'll be honest, but it's also rewarding because I am constantly writing just to get through my own life. And then I can, you know, stand up here and I have several pieces of art that I can make from my shit.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what we talked about last night, like the vanity project, the vanity of turning shit into art. And then also I'm thinking about a poem I wrote a while ago that I haven't really shared with anyone because it brutalizes the feminine body so much. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, what sort of agency do you feel to the speakers of your poems, and like how does it feel navigating
I write a lot of my poems in the first person. I think almost every time I write, I start in the first person because I don't write anything that I don't feel like I can step into completely, because I'm a very empathetic person and I can look at people and really get into how they're feeling and lend them my perspective. And when I'm writing and I'm thinking about violence enacted against women, I try to keep it as tasteful as I can. I don't do anything I wouldn't feel uncomfortable with. I mean, of course, it would be uncomfortable, but I usually have some sort of way out for the victim of the situation. For example, the Tinder poem, at the end of it, like she ran out of the house with her shoes in her hand and left a lot of her things behind. And I want to, have resolutions like that where women get themselves out and it's not as violent as it could have been. But I also think about, I think a lot about what people deserve at the same time. Give them the time and the space to stand up and take care of themselves. That's what I want in my poetry, is to see women taking care of themselves. And while some of them don't always achieve that, I am a narrative poet, and I feel like some of these poems that I think stand pretty okay on their own, I think that they also work together with each other of documenting what's happening. And I'm not too afraid to write violence. I'm pretty comfortable with writing violence in an unfortunate way. But yeah, I feel like some things are so grotesque, and the way that humans connect with each other and communicate with each other are just not it. And I'm tired of hearing it. So I'm gonna write it down. Any more questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming to listen to my talk. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much. Have and enjoy your rest of the day. Thanks.